Have you ever wondered, from a country devastated after the Civil War, how did the United States in just over 50 years turn into a power that made the whole world respect and fear it? In this video, we will travel from the transcontinental railroads and the notorious capitalist tycoons to the fiery battles of the First World War. Watch until the end, because it was these very years that quietly created the America that the whole world has to be wary of today. After the last gunshots of the American Civil War in 1865, before the gunpowder smoke had time to fade, on the plowed-up fields of the South and the bustling factories of the North, a new America was slowly taking shape. That country was still full of wounds, hundreds of thousands of people dead, towns burned to the ground. The economy of the South almost completely collapsed. But from those ashes, Americans once again looked toward the future with an almost stubborn kind of faith. They believed they could rebuild everything and build it even bigger, richer, and far more powerful than before. The years after the Civil War were a period of reconstruction, but Americans did not just patch up what had been lost. They began reaching out across the entire continent. Transcontinental railroads were built, linking the East Coast to the West Coast. Soot-black trains rumbled across prairies, canyons, and deserts, hauling timber, coal, grain, iron ore, and also the dreams of getting rich. The railroads turned a vast land once seen as a wild frontier into a network that tied together a national economy. In that context, America stepped into a phase that historians later called the Gilded Age. On the surface, the country glittered with new buildings, railway lines, massive factories, and billionaires who got rich at an unbelievable speed. But beneath that gilded layer lurked corruption, injustice, exploitation, poverty, sweat, and the tears of millions of workers, farmers, and immigrants. This was the age of industrial explosion. Steel became the backbone of the new America. Steel for rails, bridges, train stations, and high-rise buildings. Steel allowed cities like New York and Chicago to grow vertically with skyscrapers. The railroads expanded so aggressively that each mile of track became a full-blown economic battle. And oil, which at first was just a dirty black liquid seeping from the ground, slowly turned into the blood of the new economy, used to light lamps, power machines, and later fuel cars and ships. Out of that explosion, a new generation of capitalist tycoons rose up. John D. Rockefeller built the Standard Oil empire, gradually controlling almost every stage of finding, extracting, transporting, refining, and distributing oil. A near monopoly. Andrew Carnegie did something similar in steel from iron ore mines and the railroads that carried the ore to the steel mills. Every link lay inside a system he controlled. J.P. Morgan stood behind the scenes, using the power of finance to buy and merge large companies, creating giants like U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in the world at that time. To many contemporaries, they were captains of industry, leaders of industry, and symbols of boldness, creativity, and success. But in the eyes of many others, they were robber barons, aristocrats of plunder who used tricks, political manipulation, the crushing of rivals, and the exploitation of workers to get rich. Call them what you will. One thing is undeniable: Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, and families like the Vanderbilts helped shape American-style capitalism, a capitalism full of opportunity, but also full of conflict, harsh to the point of ruthlessness. But industrialization was not just the story of the tycoons. It was the story of the nameless workers in factories toiling 10 to 12 hours a day, without safety gear or insurance, with accidents happening like daily bread. It was the story of children only 10 or 12 years old, forced to crawl into coal mines and textile mills, tiny hands working like those of an adult. It was the story of immigrants who had barely stepped off the ship at Ellis Island, unable to speak English, crammed into cramped, damp tenements in the slums, working from dawn to exhaustion at night, not knowing where their future would lead. The great wave of immigration from Europe poured into America at the end of the 19th century. Irish fleeing famine, Italians escaping poverty and violence, Jews running from pogroms in Eastern Europe, Germans and Scandinavians seeking new farmland. They turned America into a melting pot of peoples, a society of many ethnicities, religions, and languages. They believed in the American dream, the belief that with hard work and endurance, their children would have a better life than they did. But the road to that dream was full of obstacles: racism, religious discrimination, labor exploitation, and street violence. Meanwhile, American cities swelled at a dizzying speed. Electric lights, telephones, elevators, water systems, and urban sewers slowly transformed everyday life. In the central districts, skyscrapers, theaters, banks, and luxurious hotels rose up. But just a few streets away, there were slums and shabby districts packed with the poor, where rooms were so cramped that families of 6 or 7 had to sleep in a single small room, starved of light and air. Those injustices gradually pushed American society into new conflicts. Workers organized strikes for higher wages, shorter working hours, and the right to form unions. Some strikes turned into violence, clashing with police and the National Guard, and there were even bombings like the Haymarket Affair in Chicago in 1886. Many Americans, for the first time, were forced to confront a difficult question: was the price of this explosive wealth the suffering of a huge part of the population in politics? Corruption and political machines ran rampant. In cities like New York, groups such as Tammany Hall controlled elections, bought votes, divided spoils, and traded jobs or protection for ballots. Many congressmen, governors, and officials fell under the sway of the tycoons, and the line between the state and big business grew increasingly blurred. This was the corroded inside that the gilded exterior tried to cover up. It was not only urban workers who were angry. Farmers in the Midwest and the South were furious as well. They had to borrow money to buy seed, fertilizer, and machinery. But crop prices were unstable, while the railroads and banks held the advantage in freight rates and interest. Many went bankrupt, lost their land, and their families were pushed into ruin. From this came the populist movement, which denounced the power of Wall Street and demanded state intervention to protect small producers. By the end of the 19th century, a report from the U.S. Census Bureau declared that the frontier, the wild land open to expansion, had nearly disappeared. North America had been largely divided and its land heavily exploited. Many thinkers, such as Frederick Jackson Turner, argued that the frontier, once the testing ground that had helped create the American character, was now gone. A new question began to flicker. If there was no more frontier on the continent, would America go searching for a new frontier overseas? It was in this context that Cuba, an island in the Caribbean still under Spanish colonial rule, erupted in its struggle for independence. Americans followed the uprisings in Cuba through sensational newspapers, emotional stories about the brutality of Spanish rule. The explosion of the U.S. battleship Maine in Havana Harbor in 1898, the cause of which is still debated, became the final straw. The slogan "Remember the Maine" swept across front pages and protests, fueling a wave of calls for war. In 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. On the surface, the reason was to help Cuba win independence and to defend American rights and honor. Underneath, it was also a chance for America to test itself as a military power and extend its reach into the Caribbean and the Pacific. The war was swift. In Cuba, American troops and Cuban rebels drove out Spanish forces. In the Philippines, the U.S. fleet under Admiral Dewey attacked the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay and quickly won. The Spanish-American War ended after only a few months with the Treaty of Paris in 1898, but its consequences lasted for decades. Spain had to give up its remaining colonies in the Western Hemisphere and the Pacific. The United States took control of the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico, and at the same time established powerful influence in Cuba, which was independent in name but bound by terms that allowed the United States to intervene deeply in its politics and economy. At the same time, the United States annexed Hawaii, a formerly independent kingdom overthrown by pro-American forces only a few years earlier. Within a short time, the United States possessed or controlled a chain of islands stretching from the Caribbean, with Cuba and Puerto Rico, to the Pacific, with Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines. For many historians, 1898 marks the moment when the United States formally joined the ranks of imperial powers. Not just a strong industrial country, but one with colonies, naval bases, and global influence. Yet not all Americans rejoiced at this leap. An anti-imperialist movement arose, bringing together intellectuals, politicians, and famous writers such as Mark Twain. They asked, how could a nation that had once claimed to fight for freedom and against European empires now go out and seize colonies like those very empires? Was the United States betraying the principles of freedom and democracy it had always proclaimed? That question became even sharper when America found itself in a new war in the Philippines. At first, Many Filipinos thought the United States would free them from Spain and grant them independence. But once Spain was defeated, the United States did not grant independence, instead taking the Philippines as a colony. This led to the Philippine-American War, a bloody, drawn-out, and brutal conflict in which the Filipino people suffered terribly. For many nations in Asia and Latin America, this was the moment they realized that the United States was no longer just a freedom-loving republic, but a new empire. While it was expanding outward, the United States began another transformation at home, the Progressive Era, in the early 20th century. Many investigative journalists, known as muckrakers, exposed scandals of corruption, abuse, horrible working conditions, filthy food in slaughterhouses, and the political manipulation of big corporations. Their articles and books stirred public outrage and forced the government to step in and reform. Presidents such as Theodore Roosevelt, followed by William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson, took on the great trusts, the huge monopolistic corporations. Some companies were broken up, antitrust laws were passed, and the state gained more power to regulate railroads, food, and medicines. In many places, working hours were gradually shortened, child labor laws were tightened, and the issue of women's voting rights was finally placed seriously on the table. But no matter how deep the reforms went, it was impossible to deny that the American economy was developing at a staggering pace. Factories, farms, coal mines, ore mines, banks, and insurance companies linked into one huge network. From Chicago to New York, from Pittsburgh to Detroit, from New Orleans to San Francisco, goods, capital, labor, and technology constantly flowed. By the beginning of the 20th century, the United States had become one of the largest and most dynamic economies in the world, surpassing many European powers that had dominated the 19th century. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Europe was sinking into a crisis whose horror few at the time could imagine: the First World War. In 1914, after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, a web of alliances and hatred snapped into place and dragged all of Europe into a war between two blocs, the Central Powers, including Germany and Austria-Hungary, and later the Ottoman Empire, and the Allies, including Britain, France, Russia, and later Italy and others. The United States, under President Woodrow Wilson, declared neutrality. Many Americans still wanted to keep their distance from Europe's wars and focus on business. But neutrality did not mean staying uninvolved. From the first years of the war, the American economy leaned toward Britain and France. American banks lent vast sums of money to the Allies, and American companies sold them food, weapons, raw materials, and other goods. If Britain and France lost, the United States risked losing what it had lent and forfeiting a huge market. So even while officially staying out of the war, the United States had deep interests tied to its outcome. At sea, the conflict grew even more complicated. Germany launched unrestricted submarine warfare, using U-boats to attack both warships and merchant ships to cut off the Atlantic supply lines to Britain. Cargo ships and passenger liners, including ships carrying American citizens, were sunk. One shocking incident was the sinking of the Lusitania, a British ship carrying many American passengers, by a German U-boat in 1915. More than 100 people died, including 128 Americans. Outrage swept the United States, and many began to wonder whether America could continue to stay out of the war. After the Lusitania, Germany at times backed down and promised to limit attacks on passenger ships to avoid bringing America into the war. But by early 1917, with the war dragging on and resources running thin, German leaders decided to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, accepting the risk of pushing the United States into the enemy camp. American ships continued to be sunk, and the human and financial losses mounted. At the same time, the Zimmermann Telegram, in which Germany secretly proposed an alliance with Mexico against the United States and promised to return lost territories, was exposed and published in the press, further enraging American public opinion. By then, President Wilson, who had once campaigned with the slogan, "He kept us out of war," slowly concluded that the United States could no longer remain on the sidelines. In April 1917, Wilson appeared before Congress and asked for a declaration of war against Germany, arguing that America had to enter the struggle to make the world safe for democracy and to protect its rights at sea. Congress agreed. The United States now went into the First World War not just with words, but with soldiers, weapons, and money. A country that had once focused mainly on developing its own continent now had to prepare to send hundreds of thousands and then millions of its sons across the Atlantic. The army expanded at unprecedented speed. A draft law was passed, calling young men into service. Training camps sprang up to turn farm boys, workers, and students into infantry, artillery, and engineers. On the home front, people were urged to buy Liberty bonds to finance the war. Women went to work in factories, offices, and hospitals to replace the men at the front. When the first units of the American Expeditionary Forces under General John J. Pershing landed in France, the soldiers of the Allied armies looked at them with a mix of hope and curiosity. They came from a country that had never fought a total war on European soil. Their faces were young, but their bodies were strong and their spirits high. In the final campaigns of 1918, American forces played an important role in stopping Germany's last offensives and then joining the counterattacks that helped bring the war to an end more quickly. When the guns fell silent on the Western Front in November 1918, Europe was exhausted, millions dead, cities shattered, economies in ruins, and debts piled high. The United States, in contrast, had suffered no destruction on its own soil. Its factories had run at full capacity during the war to produce weapons, food, and supplies for the Allies. After the war, instead of borrowing money, many European countries now owed money to America. From being a debtor in the 19th century, the United States had become one of the world's great creditors in the 20th, and New York now rose to challenge London as the financial capital of the world. Yet the war also left deep marks on American society. Veterans returned with horrific memories of the trenches. Fears of communism flared after the Russian Revolution. Strikes, labor conflicts, and racial violence erupted in many places. America entered the 1920s feeling both proud of its role as the supposed savior of the Allies and unsettled by the dizzying pace of change. Looking back from 1918 and comparing it with America in 1865, we can see an enormous transformation. From a nation patching itself up after a civil war and relying mainly on agriculture, the United States had become an industrial power of skyscraper cities, sprawling rail networks, and massive corporations. From a country largely confined to the North American continent, it had pushed out into the Caribbean and the Pacific, acquiring colonies, naval bases, and political and economic influence in many regions. From a position of standing aside in Europe's wars, the United States had stepped onto the global stage as a decisive factor in the Allies' victory in the First World War. Behind all these changes lay a chain of paradoxes. This was a country that spoke of freedom, yet seized colonies, a society that praised the American dream, yet left millions of workers, farmers, and immigrants in misery, an economy bursting with opportunity, yet riddled with crises, strikes, and inequality. Those paradoxes created an undercurrent running through later American history, sometimes erupting into social movements, sometimes simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode again. But whether we love or hate it, admire or criticize it, it is hard to deny that the period from 1865 to 1918 was the time when America changed its skin most dramatically. In just over half a century, from the ashes of the Civil War to the trenches of the First World War, the United States transformed itself from a growing industrial nation into a new great power on the world stage, a character that from then on would be almost impossible to leave out of any major story of humanity.